everyone, and welcome back to Brown Coat Reviews. I'm your host, Laura. Now, today is a monumental day because this is the very first national holiday of Juneteenth, also known as June 19th. Today is a day of mourning, of remembrance, and celebration for the day that the African-American slaves here in the United States were emancipated. Thanks to President Biden for signing this into law, we have an opportunity to look back at where we've come as a country, where we are today, and where we hope to be. But what does this have to do with comic books? I was just going to do a simple review of Represent, which came out this week, but instead I wanted to really highlight DC. Now, before I continue on, let me just give my disclaimer, which is there are other publishing companies that have done a phenomenal job of representing characters of diverse backgrounds. However, I've seen here in 2021 where DC has made a very strong stance that they are not just in general against overall racism, they have made it clear that they are anti-racist. They will not stand for it, and they will make it abundantly clear that yes, these uncomfortable situations happen, exist, and they can be discussed and fixed. So when you have stories like Represent, and the Other History of the DC Universe, and the next Batman, and the milestone characters that are returning, it speaks volumes. And it doesn't just show that only one author or one storyline is going to highlight this situation. Instead, it shows overall, this is the stance of the publishing company, and this is what they want to make sure the message that you hear today is that things can be different, and they will be different. So let me talk to you really quickly about the comic books that I'm discussing. Like I said, just here in 2021. Other History of the DC Universe. This is issue number 1 featuring Black Lightning. What I loved about this story, the same month that this came out, which was Black History Month, Marvel Voices was also released. Marvel Voices was a cute story, and it was done by some amazing artists and writers of color who obviously were featuring characters of color. But most of the stories were about 2 to 4 pages long, and because you had such a collection of different individual stories, it was really hard to go really deep into some of the issues. They did try to make sure, of course, everything's, nicely concluded, similar to Represent, but there wasn't a lot of room to really go too deep into it. So it was an enjoyable story. But in the same month, DC released the Other History of the DC Universe. Wow. John Ridley wrote this. John Ridley is the Oscar-winning screenwriter for 12 Years a Slave. So when he approached anti-racism or the history of racism for this particular character of Black Lightning, he didn't pull any punches, to be very honest. What he wanted to do was make sure that you understood the absolute anger and frustration of this character. He's a teacher, and he is working in a colored community, and he lives in that same colored community, and he sees the influence of the gangs and the violence on his students and on his family. So when he gets powers, he takes it upon himself to protect those around him and to save his neighborhood and to do some good. But every time he does some good, there's a consequence. And it talks about that anger and frustration and how he's kind of trying to use it for good, but then how it poisons all at the same time. What I loved about this story was that for me personally, I have had close relationships and friendships, and I've been very active in the Black community. So I've had the opportunity to sit across the table and talk to someone about their experiences and how their lives were different just because of their skin color. Not everyone's had that opportunity. What this story did is give you that opportunity to hear some of those stories and some of those experiences, so then you can understand why people today are still so angry over the massive injustices that are happening, because they've had to endure the small injustices every day for so many years and just suffer in silence because this is just the way it is. And if you speak out, then you must be, unhinged, or you must be just too angry and bitter, always bitter. This, I thought, was absolutely brilliant, and it makes sense why it is Eisner nominated. I absolutely loved it. I highly recommend it. This is coming out in a trade very soon. Read it at least once. If you don't want to own it, that is perfectly understandable. Grab it from your library. Check it out. Just give it a chance, because I think you will be very surprised at the amount of content that is included in this story. Part 2 also featured characters of color. Part 3 featured a character from Asian descent. Part 4 featured a character from the LGBTQ community. And each one has featured how these different characters have faced the different challenges in their communities. The other huge one that we had this year was The Next Batman, which in the Future State series was our Black Batman. This, of course, is my Ken Lashley cover that I absolutely love. But this Batman is talking about not only just the racism that is going on in this future state community against people who wear masks, but you also have the inner turmoil within the family. So you have a huge divide of some members of his family are for people with masks, against people with masks, and how it has kind of broken everyone into individual sides. And yes, that is something that racism will do to a family, as people either take a stance, take a different stance, or take no stance at all. It is a very dividing part of our community, our lives, and our families. Milestone returns. Of course, we have the Milestone characters that are here. So we have Milestone and Static. Static just came out this week. Icon and Hardware are coming out soon. So these characters are certainly facing racism. They are trying to take on, whether it's, neighborhoods and make them better, or bullying in their own schools. There are a lot of different challenges that these characters are going to be facing, and I'm really curious what kind of stances will happen because of this series. But because it's written by DC, I don't expect them to hold back any punches. So I think it's going to be really well done. So far, there's been a lot of excitement about these Milestone characters. Lastly is Represent. Now, this is a collection of 7 individual issues in one storyline. Technically, these were released in 2020 in a digital form. This is the first time that it's been released in a physical format. The only catch I will give you is issue number 1, which is currently free on Comixology. The last 3 or 4 pages of that particular comic gave some reflection on the injustices that have happened very recently of people who were, in essence, guilty of nothing more than being Black. And those last 3 or 4 pages did not show up in issue number 1, which honestly, those references were some of the most impactful parts of issue number 1 for me. So great story, but I actually recommend grabbing the digital copy, because that's the part of issue number 1 that hits you in the gut in a good way. Represent is similar to the Marvel Voices that I was describing earlier. Each one of the issues has maybe about 8 pages to make their point. And they talk about different ways that the Black community has tried using their voices to make a difference, whether it's talking to the next generation. There's a little girl in one of the stories whose favorite character is Wonder Woman, and she cannot wait to someday become a superhero and take on the world in her invisible jet. Except she gets to school and she's supposed to do this report on her hero, except the hero doesn't exist. So instead, her grandmother tells her the story of one of her ancestors and how that ancestor helped free the slaves. But at the end of the story, instead of just saying, well, Wonder Woman is irrelevant, the little girl now has 2 very strong women to look up to, even though, yes, one is fictitious, but still fights to stand against injustices. And the real-life woman who made a difference and taught people how to stand up and fight and make a difference in their world today. So, very, very interesting stories. There were a couple of them that were a little simpler, some of them that really hit home. Overall, what they were talking about in this series are the anti-racism things that I'm talking about here. We talk about the heritage of the Black community. We talk about where they've come from, where they are today, and the challenges that they're facing today. Again, it was another opportunity where DC didn't want to just rest on their laurels and say, okay, well, we've already done a Black Batman. We're good. We're releasing a Black Superman. We're good. Instead, they wanted to push and say that we can do more with our voice and we can represent the Black community better. I think that they did a phenomenal job. When you look at everything as a whole of their stance, and you look at these different characters and you look at the quality of the stories, they don't go for a tyrannical, Nazi type of character where every person who is perpetrating the racism is all evil all the time. Instead, they talk about the differences in the experiences with characters like Superman and how he is seen and treated in the community as opposed to Black Lightning. Or Batman is treated differently or reacts differently to the racism than Black Lightning. So some really cool examples and some thought-provoking moments. So looking back at this as a Juneteenth, I think it speaks volumes. And I think that one way or another, DC is trying to make sure that a Black voice is heard and understood and properly represented. And I think that is phenomenal. So next year for Juneteenth, I'm hoping that maybe as a society, we will have moved forward just a little bit further. And who knows what that means for the comic book world. Maybe other people will be joining on the bandwagon, or maybe DC is going to be the only one that is talking about some seriously hard topics. That's okay, because I think so far DC has done a phenomenal job with it. And I hope you all have a fantastic Juneteenth, and I will see you all again very soon. Have a great day.